Okay, as you know, every year I do a research project about history. Last year I did the how trains went from St. Paul to Minneapolis. The year before I did why isn't there a transcontinental railroad in the U.S.? Looks like there may be now. We'll see what happens with the UP and the Norfolk and Western. But anyway, this year I decided to look at how people got to the West Coast from Chicago via train, obviously, because we're the Railway Historical Society, but also look at air versus bus and the car. So we're going to look at key passenger trains west and compare the passenger trains. Look at some of the details. And we'll look at train times, when they left, arrived, and we'll look at Chicago to Seattle and Vancouver, and then San Francisco, and then Los Angeles. We'll look at in 19, interestingly, the number of railroad passengers in the United States peaked in 1920. So we're going to look at 1948, right after World War II, when the country kind of got squared away again. And then there was a second peak of railroad passengers before the jets. And that's with all the streamlined trains, people actually started taking the trains again. But then, of course, once the jet airplanes started going across the country, that kind of then we'll look at 20 years after, 20 years later, after Amtrak is kind of settled in, and today. And then we'll look at today. Now, my impression is that in the 1930s, the way they made trains comfortable was to just make the cars really heavy. Obviously, most of them had 6 axles and big heavy cars, and it was powered by steam, and they were relatively slow because the steam engines started slowly, and they didn't get their horsepower. The steam engines get their highest horsepower at full speed. Once they got going, they're pretty good. But then in the early 30s, the railroad started experimenting with diesel electrics, and there's a picture of the Zephyr there, the original Zephyr, and lightweight trains.
Perfect.
And these were lightweight trains, but they rode well because they had learned a lot about dynamics, and they had shock absorbers and better suspension than the older trains. Well, as we've seen over the years, the railroads have flirted with the articulated trains, but unfortunately, they're not flexible, and passenger loadings are not level at all. They're high in the summer and around Christmas, and then they're low in the spring and the fall. And so then they went back to conventional lightweight cars, but they had better ride because they had shock absorbers and advanced
Nice
dampers.
picture.
So this is 1947. The Great Northern ordered the Empire Builder, and they picked Great Northern had good stylists, and this is one of their more successful paint schemes. They started out with two E7s. The E7, of course, had two 1,000 horsepower, 567 cubic inch per cylinder diesels, and General Motors did that because if they're out on the road and one engine fails, they can isolate it, and they still have half of an engine, half of it a diesel. But they found in the mountains that the E units only have 4 motors in each unit. The center idler is just an idler wheel, and so they found that they needed later they changed to F units, so they'd run 3 or 4 F units, which had doubled the tractive effort. And so here's the route of the Great Northern. Obviously, the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific controlled the Burlington, so the Burlington would take the Empire Builder and they take it right to Chicago and back. And then they go out, the Great Northern went out the so-called main line at that time, which was Wilmer, Benson, Morris to Moorhead, and then they took the Surrey cutoff that up to Minot, and then straight west from there. And they kept that route right up until, and that's pretty much the route that Amtrak uses, except that they go on the NP up to they're using the Milwaukee to get to St. Paul, and then the NP to get to Fargo, and then they go to Grand Forks. But other than that, it's the same. And so here's a calendar shot of the Empire Builder in the Rockies. And as you know, the Great Northern basically started Glacier National Park, which is one of the most successful parks in the country. And the southern border of Glacier Park is the Great Northern. And that was really Louis Hill, Jim Hill's son, pushed that because he saw it was a real opportunity. Now Jim was a freight guy, as you know, so he kind of said, "Well, I don't think it's that big a deal, but Louis, you're my son, so if you want to do it, fine." And so it obviously turned out to be a huge thing for the Great Northern. Now here's the Burlington bringing the Empire Builder into Chicago, coming into Union Station a little later on in the 60s. And they used 2 E units because it's pretty flat from St. Paul to Chicago, so that was no problem. Now here's the commercial map that the Great Northern had. They showed all their routes, but it's basically the same route with the addition of the route to Portland. So if we look at the details, in 1948, the Empire Builder was #1. It had left Chicago at this is all 24-hour time, obviously. So 1 p.m. arrived in St. Paul in the evening, and then Seattle in the morning a couple days later. Now, in 1955, the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific decided, okay, we got to merge, because Jim Hill had merged them under Northern Trust at the 1900, but then Teddy Roosevelt broke it up with the Sherman Antitrust Act. But they decided, okay, it's time to do it again. So they started looking at it, and one of the things they saw is they were going to have to renumber all the trains because they had a lot of conflicts. So they renumbered the Empire Builder number 31 in the 50s. And they actually took an hour off. They shaved an hour off the schedule. So that was pretty fast. They left at 2 p.m. and got into St. Paul in the evening, and then Seattle in the morning. Now in 1978, Amtrak had number 7. Now they were trying at that time to run, they left Chicago in the evening, arrived in St. Paul in the morning, and then Seattle in the evening. Now they tried that, but unfortunately you went through the Cascades during the day, but unfortunately you went through Glacier at night, so that didn't work out too well. So today they're pretty much right back to the schedule, pretty much the same schedule they had back in 1948. This is a picture I took in Havre in 1965, and we see that the Empire Builders are using four F units. As I said, they changed to F units because that each one is 1,500 horsepower, but the main thing is they all have traction motors. So instead of having a total of 120,000 pounds of tractive effort, now they have 240,000 pounds. The other thing I noticed is that they'd always ran, 13, 14, 15 cars, but I thought, gee, in the summer they would run 4 units. And then I realized, of course, if you remember being on the Empire Builder in those days, it got really cold in the cars in the summer when you were out on the road. And of course, that was because all the air conditioners were connected to pulleys on the wheels. And of course, that took a lot of load with 14, 15 cars. And so they had to add an extra F unit just in effect for hotel power. So the Empire Builder went 2,210 miles. In 1948, it took 45 hours. And they had about 20 stops, plus they had 12 flag stops. In 58, they knocked it down to 44 hours, so it was pretty fast. In 78, it was 47 hours. Still pretty good. And interestingly, they went, Amtrak went via Grand Forks, but the Empire Builder went down to the Tri-Cities, Pasco, Kennewick, and then back up to on the NP. And then the North Coast went straight across. I suppose that was some trying to levelize the scheduling or something like that. But today they're right back to the old schedule. It's 46 hours, pretty close to what it was, and they go via Grand Forks. And when Amtrak came in, basically Great Northern and Northern Pacific and Burlington sold them most of their passenger equipment, and including the units, and they started repainting them. And so you can see it was a combination of Amtrak, Burlington Northern, NP, Great Northern, Burlington, all sorts of things. Then in 1975, Amtrak got the SDP 40F, which is basically an SD40-2 with a cowl and a steam generator. And I'll talk more about these later because that had a real history. But here's the train coming in with heritage equipment, all sorts of different combination of paint schemes and stuff, but it's coming eastbound into Havre. And you can see Havre has always been a big stop, because there's a lot of people getting on and off the train in Havre, and also people get off and they have a whole bunch of most of you have been there, ice cream sandwich machines. So you can, it's like going back to the 50s, and everybody goes up and has one of those old-fashioned ice cream sandwiches. But the Amtrak and well, the Great Northern at that time, before that, had the east-west traffic across northern Montana. Because if you wanted, I had to fly one time when I was out there with my grandfather, and we had to fly on a metro liner, which is everybody gets an aisle, everybody gets a window, no bathroom. But I think there were about 12 of us on it. We had to go to Lewiston and then to Billings. That's the only way you could leave Havre. And so the east-west stuff obviously was on Amtrak. And you can see at that time they were still washing the windows on the domes and all the windows of the cars and everything. It was pretty cool. So a lot of people got on, got off. It was a big stop in Havre. It still is. So now we'll talk about the North Coast Limited. That was pretty much the standard route that the NP took. Same thing with, they would go to Chicago with the Burlington, and then they went up from St. Paul to Fargo. And the NP was built 10 years before the Great Northern. So that's why all the big cities in North Dakota and Montana are on the NP. I mean, if you go west, you're going Moorhead, Fargo, Bismarck, Valley City, Glendive, Miles City, Billings, Helena, Butte, Missoula. Everything is along the NP. And then they went down from Spokane, they went down to the Tri-Cities and then up through the Stampede Tunnel. Now the NP, they had it when they started. This is 47 when the Great Northern bought the Empire Builder. The NP bought the North Coast Limited. Now the North Coast Limited had actually been around since 1900, so it was just modernizing the train. But it was a pretty conservative paint scheme, and that was sort of fit the NP's culture, because the NP had gone bankrupt 3 times for a number of reasons. One was when they built it, they built it straight west, and they had a huge land grant, 44 million acres. If you can imagine, they had 200 miles each side of the railroad in North Dakota and Montana, all the way out there, and then some in Minnesota too, a checkerboard. But the government didn't give them any cash, because they had given money to the UP. And if you remember what happened to the UP, Durant and General Dodge organized this Credit Mobilier, and they basically stole about half the money. So the government said, no, we're going to give the NP, we're just going to give them a lot of land. They can sell that and then build the railroad. Well, unfortunately, the financing was always a little shaky, and they went bankrupt 3 times. And I personally think that really shell-shocked the organization, because the NP was always much more conservative than the Great Northern. They would always think about things very carefully. They kept steam longer than the Great Northern did. Great Northern was always willing to get out there and do new things. They were the first ones to buy the SD-45, and they were really much more elaborate on things, because they'd never gone bankrupt. Jim Hill had organized it so well, and he built branch lines and always had made money on the way out to the West Coast. So the North Coast Limited again was number 1 in 1948. It left Chicago in the evening, arrived in St. Paul a little later in the morning, and then Seattle. In 1958, because again they were changing all the numbers, they went to number 25 for the North Coast. And it left Chicago around noon, and then they had taken about 10 hours off the schedule, if you can imagine, because they had to match the Great Northern. The North Coast was pretty slow in the 40s and the early 50s. And so then it got to Seattle. And in Amtrak in 1978 still had the 17, which was the North Coast Hiawatha. And that ran 3 times a week. And the reason it was there was because Senator Mike Mansfield was the chairman of the Transportation Committee in the Senate. And he was from Montana, and he said, we're going to have 2 trains. And so they had 2 trains for a long time, as long as he was senator. The distance, they went 23:19, about the same as the Great Northern. But as you can see, in 48, it took 58 hours, whereas the Empire Builder was 45. So it was pretty slow, only 39 miles an hour. They had 35 stops plus 10 flag stops. And so then when they reorganized it and they got Raymond Lloyd to repaint it and they bought new cars in the early 50s, it was number 25 and they actually took 10 hours off the schedule. That was pretty impressive. And then Amtrak in 1978 had number 17, was even a little bit faster, and but it went via Wenatchee. And so this is the paint scheme that the upgraded North Coast had. Now I heard several stories about this. The one I heard was Raymond Lloyd went out and sat on a bluff and he was sketching all day. And this is the green is the green of the spruce in western Montana, and the light green is the color of the river that he saw coming off of a glacier, and the white is the snow. Then we'll look at the Western Star next. Now this is a picture from the internet. It's near Great Falls, and he's crossing the Missouri River, which goes through Great Falls. And in the 50s, Great Northern actually ran the Western Star down to Great Falls and then back up to Havre, as you see here. Because Great Falls at the time was the fastest growing, largest city in Montana. They had a lot of industry going on. They were upgrading Malmstrom Air Force Base with all sorts of new planes, and they were adding Minuteman missiles and all sorts of stuff. So the Great Northern had a lot of traffic there. So they were actually, instead of having just the connecting trains from Havre, they actually ran the entire Western Star down to Great Falls and then back up. This is a picture I like. I got it off the internet. It's at Fargo, and old Northern States Power Plant. I worked for Northern States Power, so I always thought it was interesting to see. And you can see the two short chimneys are the two original units they probably built in the 20s, and then they built two units off to the left there after the 40s, and then one big one in the 50s. But the city of Fargo is saying, hey, you can't have this big coal pile downtown Fargo, So eventually they had to, and the plant was old, so they tore it. So the North Coast and the Mainstreeter went basically the standard route across the NP, the Main Street of the Northwest. This is the the Mainstreeter out west. So if we compare all the trains, Great Northern had the Oriental Limited. That was kind of in 1948. That was their secondary train, number 3. It departed St. Paul in the evening, Chicago in the evening, arrived in St. Paul in the morning, and then Seattle a couple days later in the morning. The Alaskan was on the NP in 48. That was number 3. That left in the afternoon, arrived in St. Paul in the evening, and then Seattle in the morning a few days later. So Great Northern in 58, they changed the Western Star to number, they kept that as number 3. Pretty much the same schedule. And the Mainstreeter, they changed the number, and there's the train leaving Fargo. I took this picture right about the merger time. This is coming in north of early in the spring, and so that's why it's a small train. I took a lot of Kodachromes, and usually they did pretty well, but this one, obviously, the operator must have been on break or something, because I got amoebas all over the slide. So distance-wise, in 48, the Oriental Limited went 22:11, and on the Great Northern. The Northern Pacific Alaskan went 23:19, pretty close, the same, but it was 58 hours, and they had 30 stops plus 35 flag stops on the Oriental Limited. The Alaskan was about the same schedule, a little slower, 68 hours. And then in 58, Great Northern and the NP matched their speeds, so they're both about 60 hours. And obviously they took some of the cars and they were combined from St. Paul to Chicago and back. Here's another shot of the